Welcome to an audio reading of The First Run, a short story by H.M. Brown. If for one moment you told me there are farmlands in New Jersey, I for one will laugh my head off. New Jersey farmlands? What do they grow? Mutant corn? That was the assignment bestowed upon me. See, there was this rumor that in the farmlands of southern New Jersey, or South Jersey as the locals call it, a new mode of transportation was invented. Yet it was hard for me to believe that such a thing was possible. What other mode of transportation could possibly be made in this era? My first thought when I watched science fiction on television was teleportation. I dismissed it as such a fiction. When I glazed through the notes of rumors and witness testimony provided by my editor, I found what is said to be a joke. A giant robot? Please. People have seen such things built by the Japanese in news reports or in science fiction film and books. My impression was that it was a waste of time, but I did go to South Jersey anyway to see what this robot was all about. Now, for many of you who are asking, farmlands in New Jersey, I can assure you that I was surprised at this fact as any other. When I traveled through New Jersey to get to Philadelphia, I am surrounded by nothing but tall steel buildings and factories. The New York Jersey City area had grown in technology and stretched across the Raritan Valley into Trenton and south along the Delaware River ending in Camden. And yes, the Delaware River from Trenton to Philadelphia on both sides of the river is one big chain of city that were once suburbs and now a metropolis. The train system that ran from New Haven, Connecticut to Philadelphia, known as the Northeast Corridor, evolved into a never-ending tourist ride through a world of steel and glass one would find at a World of Tomorrow theme ride. The Meadowlands itself, now seen as a giant-sized Central Park from satellite photos, surrounded by a land of silver and lights. Only the pinelands in the south and the skylands on the edge of Appalachia in the northwest remain as the remnants of nature. As Ben Franklin once quoted, New Jersey is a barrel tapped at both ends, that being New York City and Philadelphia. Even the Jersey Shore had come to resemble Miami's shoreline of skyscrapers and highways with beaches still untouched. The technological region that is the Raritan Valley has become more advanced than Silicon Valley itself. For those who travel to Boston or to Washington will see nothing but one continuous city, surpassing that of the greater Tokyo area, which is still the largest city and region in the world. The glitz and the lights one would find in Tokyo will find it here in this monstrous chain of metropolis. Now you understand my skeptic rhetoric when I say New Jersey farmlands. I drove down the New Jersey Turnpike and exited onto a county highway, which is the equivalent of a state highway, driving through the cities of Red Bank and Monmouth and following the route that was mapped in my notes. Thankfully, I know for a fact the pinelands still do exist, so it came to no surprise when I crossed the bridge leaving the Techno City that I found the sign saying Welcome to the Pine Barrens, that I did not feel the way I felt about farmlands. Of course, this road that I drove through was treacherous, winding two-way and small ditches that made it impossible for me to turn around when I started feeling the ridiculousness of this newsworthy trip. I was forced to keep going forward until I could find an intersection to turn around and go back. In the end, I found an intersection. I turned around when I realized that I was out of the forest, and after slamming my brakes, I was in shock. I stepped out of my car, and the first sound I heard was a cow mooing in the distance. There it was, out in the open beyond the edge of the pinelands, a farm. Cows were grazing, crops in bloom, though I did not know what crop it was, and horse stables where the farm hands began to work. I stood there for a moment, not realizing that a pickup truck had stopped before me and sounded the horn because I blocked the entire intersection. Suffering from culture shock, I approached the truck and saw the license plate was from New Jersey. For a moment, I swore I was in Pennsylvania Dutch country. The horn sounded again. The driver was frustrated from my lack of realization that I had to move. I drove ahead on the same highway I was on, taking my time, recovering from the shock. Farm after farm, barn after barn, stable after stable. I looked back and could not see beyond the pines of what were once the technological cities of New Jersey. I was in another world. The residents don't seem surprised to see me. As it turned out, they are not people who live in seclusion. It was I who lived in seclusion, exclusively in the city and nowhere else. The residents were living well within our times with the latest farm equipment. The town itself that I entered was still colonial nature, rich with history but kept up with civilization as a whole. I asked the locals regarding the rumors of this giant robot. At first they chuckled and snickered, as I thought the lead was a joke, but they pointed me to a pair of brothers 20 miles southeast from the town itself, and now I became the one who thought the people were a backwards joke. However, this was a place where everyone knows each other, like a member of the family. So I headed toward Orwell Farms, which really was out of the way. I'm not even talking the boondocks here. This farm is really out of the way. Arriving at the entrance road to the Orwell Farms, I never realized what I was about to witness as I entered the dirt road. Tomatoes were growing on one side, and a vast empty land of nothing on the other side, and ahead of me a very big farm. Upon arriving, I saw two young men standing before the large farm, which doors itself was unusually large. I stepped out of my car, and we each introduced ourselves. The Orwell brothers, George the oldest and Thomas the youngest, inherited their family's farm after the passing of their parents. After introducing myself, I shared with them the information I had regarding the rumor of a giant robot. At first they seemed hesitant, but they did allow me to stay. As I waited for a while, they debated with each other. I stood before the barn's door, closed off from curious eyes. My guess was that the door stood 30 feet high. Is the giant robot that big? What type of robot was it, if that's what it was? The Orwell brothers finished their deliberation and invited me to stay for their test run. They felt confident that it was time to share the world what they had built. The brothers led me inside their barn, where they worked on their invention. When the lights turned on, all I saw were blueprints, books, and notes. What a sham this was. No giant robot, just paper. They told me that their invention, as they would only refer to it as that, was in an airfield 5 miles from their home. But before they showed me what it was, they allowed me to look over their research. Much to my surprise, I did not find one book on robots itself. They were computer books, but mostly they were medical books. The Human Anatomy, a model of the skeleton hanging off the pole they named Larry, and sports books depicting human movement from gymnastics to track and field. My first impression was that they made a human machine, a bionic human, a cyborg being. Have I stumbled onto the Dr. Frankenstein equivalent of the Wright brothers? They had no idea why my face turned pale as I stared back at them. But if this feeling I had been absorbed with is the same feeling my editor had been experiencing, then yes, it is my duty to expose these frauds for who they are. In the meantime, I played along. I listened to their explanation of how the human body functions, how muscle memory worked, the strength of the human skeletal system, the flexibility of the human physiology. All sounded interesting, but I was really more interested in the robot itself. They assured me it will all make sense when we get to the airfield, but first they had a series of tapes they had recorded of a test they ran. First and foremost, I should let you all know that they were using old DVDs to record their tests. Very low tech and seemingly out of date in this age and era, but there it was, an old DVD player showing the giant robot. According to the tape, 3 years ago they started. I couldn't make out what they were doing, being that it was an old recording device they used. From what I could make out of the footage was that the robot was nothing but a pair of legs with lower extremities. There was no chest or head at that time. The Orwell brothers got it to take one step, but it fell apart like a house of cards. The second DVD was from the following year. It had a chest, and I couldn't tell who or what was in the chest. It made horrific rumbling sounds. It was like a truck stalling on the freeway. Suddenly, a plume of smoke covered the entire barn, and the sound of fire extinguishers was all that was left of the video. In the final video, the robot was more complete. It looked like a human skinned alive. Upon taking a closer look, I grabbed one of the medical books and realized that the giant robot was modeled after the human flesh and bone. The wires looked like muscle and tendons. The knee and elbow joints were perfect. The chest and rib cage was accurate. When the footage showed the arms move, the wires flexed like muscle. It was remarkable. Unfortunately, the robot stalled and did not take a step. My fear of the brothers being mad scientists were cast aside, and I now wanted to see the robot itself. The brothers gathered all their research materials and tapes into a box, and together we rode in their pickup truck towards the airfield. As we drove along the road, I learned that their family had been in America since the Industrial Revolution. They were working class citizens, with each generation of male and female serving every war America had fought into this date. There was not one technology in Orwell had not had their hands on throughout America's history. That became a fact when we arrived at the airfield. I was led into the office first. There, I met the owner of the airfield, Alexander Cochrane. His wall was lined with photos as old as 1915. The people in the photos were actually members of the Orwell family. Rows of war photos of the family dressed in uniform, including Thomas and George's eldest brother, currently serving the front line in Asia. There was also a picture of great-great-grandpa William Orwell shaking hands with Thomas Edison himself. A female relative, their Aunt Kathy, driving one of the first Model Ts off the assembly line as part of a promotional ad. Another Orwell, Jeremiah, was seen taking a picture with the earliest known camera from the 1800s. This family experienced it all throughout American history. Strange as it was, I had to ask if they had a cave painting of one of their caveman ancestors inventing fire. I came to understand that this family were witnesses to technological evolution. For the Orwell brothers, they told me they'd rather be the inventors this time than witnesses, hence the giant robot. I entered into the main hangar where there were old airplanes, fighter planes from World War II, mostly propeller as opposed to our planes today that use sonic engines and Mach 7 speeds. At the far end of the hangar bay door, there was a large tarp-covered statue. It was the giant robot. They were preparing to bring it outside for their test run. As they opened the bay doors, I ran outside with the Orwell brothers' own camera and I started recording. The tarp was removed, and what a statue it was. It had metal covering like a human skin over the flesh of the body. It had a head with a face and yellow eyes. It was like a soldier standing proud of what it is on top of a flatbed cart. It was very tall. George said it was 25 feet in height. I had started the recording and I had a remarkable flash of insight. I remembered watching a documentary of the history of the airplane. From the angle I stood at, it felt like I was at Kitty Hawk as the Wright brothers started their plane preparing for flight. Only now it was replaced with a giant robot. They unhinged the truck that was towing the machine and I stood ready to watch it move. But it didn't. I saw Thomas run back inside the hangar as George did a final checkup with their masterpiece. I was waiting for quite some time as Elder Orwell stood waiting for his brother. There, he arrived with a large ladder. I was definitely confused as I handed the camera over to Alexander. Once the ladder was perched up, I asked George when the robot will move, and without answering, I heard a loud swishing sound. I stepped back and saw the chest of the robot open wide like a cabinet. Sliding out of the cavity was a shell. It was completely black, so I could not see inside. When it finished stretching out into the open, what appeared to be a top hatch or canopy like a cockpit of a fighter plane slid open and exposed the seat. Thomas leaned the ladder onto the shell and climbed up. He sat inside and placed the helmet over his head. He waved to me to climb up, and George held onto the ladder as I made my way to the top. Inside was the most remarkable thing I had seen, an onboard computer with the latest operating system installed. There were 4 different sticks, 2 to control the arms and hands, 2 to control the direction. Under his feet were 2 large pedals to move the legs and feet. They would rotate like a bicycle, simulating the motion of the human legs. It looked more like an exercise bike than an automobile's accelerator and brake pedal. It was ready for takeoff, and I climbed down. There, I watched the canopy close up, and the entire cockpit slid back inside the chest. Seeing that it is a completed machine, I had asked George if they tested it before my arrival. The answer was no. The rumbling sound of a truck was the noise this giant robot made. Its yellow eyes lit up like a traffic light. The cart underneath the feet shook as if an earthquake had occurred. The wheels shook so hard I feared it might break apart and send the machine crashing to the ground. Thomas sure took his time to move. It would appear that another setback was to occur. Then it happened. The right leg lifted up and forward onto the ground below. There was a slight feeling of vibration under our feet, but the robot did not collapse like I saw in the video recording. The left leg then set itself onto the ground. The robot was off the cart. Like a baby taking its first steps, the robot struggled a bit, or maybe it is Thomas who struggled. It is hard to tell, given the fact that what I first thought to be a typical robot that would walk on its own, or through a remote control, was in fact an actual vehicle in the form of a human. It really is a new form of transportation. Well, not as it seemed, as each step the orbital robot took was clunky and slow, and soon I realized it would walk no faster than us humans. Not a very convincing mode of transportation, as I noted to George, but he said to me, "This isn't for transportation. This is for agricultural, construction, and shipping industries. In fact, I can see it for emergency use, firefighting, and rescue efforts. This piloted robot can contribute greatly to society as a whole." I stood with a smile unlike any other, as I soon realized that for the first time since the Wright brothers flew their plane to the sky, I was watching a robot man taking its first baby steps in an unchanging world. With its fifth step, the machine stopped and stood upright in place. It was a success as Thomas emerged from the cockpit and George planted the ladder so that the Oro brothers celebrated their success. So many questions to ask, I did not know where to begin. I did not know how I could be able to explain in this article without sounding like a science fiction writer. But for this one moment, this very spot, I imagined coming back here with my children and read to them the plaque that marked the first steps of a new era in technology. The Oro brothers were not done though. Now that they got it to walk, George wanted to attempt to run. It was something they had to work overnight for, to make sure every joint and mechanical muscle will operate as described in the medical books. I chuckled at the thought of this giant robot pulling a cybernetic muscle or spraining its mechanical ankle, but I understood. See, a 25-foot tall machine such as this, the Oro brothers thought about balance. When we walk, we sway our arms. That, they said, should be the key in theory to make their invention run like a jogger or sprint like a track runner. That was what they felt will make or break this invention. We all returned to the hangar where the final diagnostics were made. I watched the two take out part of the outer skin, exposing the wired muscles and metallic bone. As it turned out, they had been taking parts from an old junkyard and had them recycled in a steel mill in Pennsylvania, forged into the skeletal system and skin of the robot. The cockpit did indeed come from an old F-16 fighter plane, gutted, renovated, and replaced with today's technology. The wired form of muscle came from an old telecom station that had fiber optic cables. The hydraulics from old trucks was used on the legs to handle the shock from each step. The operating system, according to George, is the brain, but the heart of the machine is where I soon realized was what will change the world. The engine. It was a 12-stroke engine, the first of its kind, designed to allow the machine to run like a track sprinter. More than that, it was electrical, a still unpopular and unaccepted piece of equipment in society. It was a lithium-ion based battery, the kind we have in our cell phones. Thomas carried a big block of salt they ordered from a salt mine in Utah. They opened the back hatch and revealed a tank that had leftover salt. They placed half of the chunk into that tank and filled it with water. They chopped it down and it dissolved into salt water. They gave me a small cup and just the scent alone was strong. One lick left my taste buds seeking both water to hydrate and sweets to kill the aftertaste. The tank heated up from the battery itself and two things happened. One, the lithium is extracted from the salt water, giving the battery its charge. Second, the steam from the boiled water is fed into the engine. Once the water is completely evaporated, all that is left is the salt in the tank that can be replenished with more salt and water. Most importantly is that this system only needed salt water. Going to the ocean alone can help replenish the fuel. As dawn approached, George was ready to make it run. Thomas, Alexander, and I got in the pickup truck after George started up the robot. He took his first 5 steps and got it under control. The oral robot picked up speed and its arms swayed back and forth with each stride. Alexander kept recording as I looked at the speedometer and saw that the robot was going 26. That's 1 over the average speed limit in the city. We ran the length of the landing strip, and at the end we came to a stop. We turned around and ran back. The robot got faster, clocking in at 32. Looking up at it, it was like an actual track runner, racing for the gold. The Orwell brothers succeeded where many robotic experts have dreamed of doing. They made a humanoid machine walk and run naturally human. We arrived at the hangar where George had to stop because he ran out of fuel. As the brothers jumped for joy, I looked out at the field staring at the footprints in the runway this machine made. It was like the moon landing, but on our Earth. With one step, history's course has written a new chapter. The world will change once again. The end. This was an audio reading of the first run by H.M. Brown. If you would like to read a copy of the first run, it is currently available in Duality of Science, a short story double feature, currently on sale on Amazon Kindle. Click on the link below for your copy today. Thank you for joining us, and have a nice evening.